Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. My name is JL Richardson, and I am the Executive Director at the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD. Welcome to FOLD Academy. I'm so excited to be your host for today. Um, this session is going to run for about an hour and will include at least 15 minutes of question and answer. So thank you so much for being here. If you are joining us and you haven't already done so, you should be able to see the chat. You can put your name in and let us know where you're joining from. We love to sort of have a sense of who's here and who's about. We are using Zoom auto captions today. So please note that as we do this live, some of the captions might not be transcribed correctly. However, all of the captions will be corrected when the recording is made available on YouTube later this week. And for those of you who are wondering and asking already, yes, there will be a recording made available. If you register for this, it will get emailed to you. If for some reason it does not get emailed to you, you will see it through YouTube. And if you subscribe or follow us on YouTube, you'll get a notification that way. So, two ways to make sure you don't miss that. If you have questions during the workshop, please put them in the question and answer box. That's where I'll be pulling questions from when I return back at the end of the workshop to talk with Amber. There will also be a PDF document that Amber is going to share, and that'll be included in the email that comes with the recording. Um, those are my main bits of announcements. I'm just going to make sure. Oh, wait, the chat is now open. I set the wrong settings. So now you can say who you are and where you're from. I said that before and it wasn't possible. So now you can chat with us and let me know where you're from. Another thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pop up a poll that just provides an opportunity for you to share your background, how you're joining us, what sort of your background or experience is. So welcome everyone. So excited to see people from across the country, even Aisha from Pakistan. Thank you for joining us. If you get a chance, please take this poll if you can see it. We just sort of wanted to know where everyone was joining from. So I'm going to find a way to make it possible for you to see that at some point. Okay. More importantly, let's get to our guest of honor. I want to introduce Amber Riaz. She is a professional technical and academic copy editor and the owner of A4 Editing. She edits academic manuscripts, journal articles, and technical reports. She works with academic presses, editorial agencies, and individual authors. She trains editors on matters of conscious language, inclusion, equity, accessibility, and plain language principles. We are so blessed to have her here. And so I'm just going to bring her in right now and disappear. And if you see that poll pop up during the presentation, take a chance to do that. Thanks. See you later.
Thank you. It is wonderful to meet all of you. I was watching the chat and my goodness, it went so fast. I couldn't quite see who was from where, but I did see all over Canada. I saw Edmonton, I saw Calgary, California, phenomenal. I'm just really honored to be presenting on behalf of Editors Canada and of FOLD. You're attending Decolonizing Editing, How to Recognize Colonial Attitudes. So let's get started. Sorry, did you guys see the poll popping up on my screen? I hope not. There we go. Okay. So let's move forward. So this webinar is being presented on November 15, 2025. I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Coquitlam peoples, a distinct and independent nation who have lived in harmony with the territory surrounding the Coquitlam River watershed since before remembered time. I've included here a link to their website. Please take the time to explore the resources and to read the About Us page. I recognize that my gesture, recognizing that the territory I now call home remains unceded, rings hollow at a deeply personal level because colonization has affected my past and my future generations irrevocably. I have been consistently aware of my own complicity because of my silence in the violence of colonization, just as I benefit from it by becoming a settler in Canada. So today, I bring attention to the genocide of the Indigenous populations of Turtle Island. And I also bear witness to the genocide of the Palestinian people and the deliberate and systemic silencing of voices today. Every person, every voice that speaks out against the current genocide in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories is being bullied into silence in multiple ways. But I still have hope because I know we are not powerless. I hope you will join me in speaking out and speaking up. Today's webinar is, in a very small way, my attempt to highlight how colonization continues to silence and to harm, and how we can do our parts in mitigating some of that harm. My commitment then is to amplify Indigenous and global majority voices and allow other perspectives to emerge. I choose to challenge privileged positions, work solely on projects that amplify historically marginalized voices, and confront voices that advocate for racist attitudes and policies. So today's presentation is a conscious language and ethical editing presentation focused on how editors and writers can recognize the colonial perspective and intervene in instances where colonial language is being used to misrepresent information. Before we can learn how to challenge colonial language, though, we need to first understand colonization and what scholars, activists, and writers are already doing to challenge colonial perspectives. So we'll begin with some definitions, and then I'll offer some tips and suggest resources before we open up Q&A. We will begin by setting our intention so we are all clear in how we can both be inclusive and radical. Then we will go over some key concepts related to decolonization and radical editing. After that, I'll offer some general tips and some suggested resources that you can use to expand your understanding of decolonization and publishing. We will reserve all questions for the Q&A. So what can we do individually to achieve our goals to ensure that we are being mindful of our readers' needs? We need to approach our professions with the understanding that we all have blind spots, things that we just do not know, and things that we simply take for granted. We may even assume that certain ideas and opinions are common knowledge when they may not be. For example, today, I don't know much about what my audience may or may not know about decolonization, so I'm working on creating a safe space for all of you here, but also for myself. Some ways that might help us create a safe space is to use the tip and the pause systems. So in general, you can take some time to reflect on your communication style, set your intention and examine the impact of your choices, establish a process that allows you to be consistent and respectful. In the pause method, as editors and writers, we can pay attention to the topic, to the material in front of us. We can then acknowledge our own limitations and the limitations of the work that we are working on. We need to understand multiple perspectives. We need to search for productive solutions if there are problems. And we need to execute the plan to mitigate the impact of some of our choices. I keep these guidelines at the forefront every time I'm editing or creating content. The key here is to ensure accuracy, specificity, and authenticity in the work we do. Please take a few seconds to think about one thing you hope to learn from today's webinar. After the timer stops, please make a note of your intention and then review it near the end to see if you've achieved what you had hoped to achieve. Here we go. The timer should be working. we go. Now just take a minute to put your intention down on paper if you haven't already, as we move on. So a gentle reminder of why we are talking about colonization. Many of us have colonial legacies. Our ancestors were either colonized or were colonizers, or we might even have both in our family trees. Canada is a settler colonial state with a long history of genocide of Indigenous people. Currently, there are at least 17 non-self-governing territories across the globe as of today. And then we are watching a live stream genocide, a direct result of colonization and Zionism. Colonization's legacies continue to distort cross-border relations. For example, Pakistan and Afghanistan recently almost went to war over the Durand Line, an arbitrary border drawn by the British in 1893. Many of the maps and articles on colonization in the 20th century are behind paywalls. And so I took a screenshot of my image search on Google. The fact that the maps are behind paywalls is also a symptom of colonization, the instinct to gatekeep knowledge and research. We'll talk about this more later in the presentation when we discuss colonization in publishing, but hold on to this idea. Here you can see how much of the world was colonized in 1914, and you can also see the different colonizers and their impact on nations, borders, geography, and by extension, cultures, languages, laws, and economy. The map does not show us non-European colonizers. This, too, is a complex, nuanced topic. We have to hold much of these histories as we move toward decolonization and reconciliation. The fundamental premise of colonization, decolonization, conscious language, EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is that people are not equal. We generally deflect, hide from this idea by talking about abstract concepts like colonization, inclusion, diversity initiatives, and so on. Social justice, true justice, would come from recognizing the power dynamics inherent in these discourses. Words like difference, diversity, equity, inclusion are all euphemisms for systemic inequality. I'll move through many of these definitions fast, but will provide as much complexity and nuance as I can. I can only give a very brief overview of many of these terms with the hope that my audience will take the time to sit with each term and then explore both the term and your own understanding of it. Before making up your mind about these topics, however, please remember to actively seek out work by Indigenous scholars first. Remember, sorry, I moved too fast. Remember that language evolves and many terms are consistently debated, reevaluated, and redefined. The list is by no means exhaustive, but it does give you a place to start. So the first definition here is of colonization. It is a domination of one nation by another, often by force. It often centers European domination of the globe and is perceived as something that has now ended. Other words related to it are imperialism and Orientalism, sometimes appropriation. Neoliberalism is another one that comes up often. Settler colonialism is the complete eradication of one nation by another and replaces pre-existing social, cultural, legal systems. It involves genocide and assumes that one culture is superior to all others. Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and much of South America are settler colonial states, built on the genocide of Indigenous peoples and the continued use of educational institutions, government policies, and industry to maintain white supremacy. Post-colonial is generally the period after colonization, and it marks a historical point where colonial powers transferred governance to Indigenous populations. Post-colonialism is the academic study of the social, political, cultural impact of colonization and assumes again that colonization has ended after or given political independence and nation formation. Pakistan and India, drawing a blank, but those are examples of post-colonial nations. In general, post-colonialism theorizes identity, cultural impact, borders, migration. It reads for silences, gaps, testimony, non-European knowledge systems, oppression. Now, the big one. Decolonization is let's start this way. The key to understanding decolonization is to recognize that it is a process and that the efforts are ongoing. The process highlights power dynamics, acknowledges systemic barriers to equity and social justice, and centers non-European ways of thinking and being. I see it as a process fundamentally determined and developed by Indigenous scholars, but also by people striving to live in a world without non-consensual domination. So in Canada, decolonization has not occurred. It decenters the dominance of Euro-Western structures of knowing. Institutions like the university and publishing industry must identify and challenge their colonial histories before they can become respectful environments for Indigenous knowledges and methodologies. And decolonization is a practice, which means that it is evolving and it looks different for different people. And that's the key here. The process of decolonization includes terms like reconciliation, which focuses on the relations between the Crown, which is the Canadian government, and the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Problems with reconciliation efforts are that they assume that we are already moving toward good relations. And then sometimes the prefix "re" assumes that we are returning to a previous state of conciliation, that at some point in history, Indigenous people were equal to the colonizer. I'm trying to think of if I've actually forgotten to say something, but we're right on the money in terms of what I wanted to say about reconciliation. Indigenous is different from reconciliation in that it focuses on increasing the presence of Indigenous peoples and knowledges in traditionally Euro-Western institutions. Issue with indigenization, though, is that it carries the risk of tokenism. And it does require institutional change, which will take quite a long time. Resurgence centers Indigenous knowledges, laws, languages, and practices. It takes the focus away from relations with the government and highlights the Indigenous social systems, cultures, languages. And scholars like Leanne Bettis, I practiced this actually, Betta Samosake Simpson and Glenn Coulthard argue for a turn away from state-centered projects like reconciliation and towards resurgence within Indigenous communities as a key part of enacting decolonization, because it is by strengthening Indigenous social systems, cultures, and languages that they can then look outward, look away from the Indigenous system. The land back movement is particularly salient in the context of British Columbia. It highlights the indigenous people's right to land ownership and stewardship. You know what? I'm going to put the entire slide up first. The movement questions reconciliation, highlighting the performative aspects of land acknowledgements, and asks, what's the point of acknowledging the ownership of land if we don't follow it up with concrete action? An example of the land back movement is the Wet'suwet'en Nation's stance in their opposition to the Northern Pipeline. And then at the end, once you get the recording via email, you will also get my entire PDF. It's two pages of resources here with websites, videos, books, journal articles, exploring all of the concepts that I'm bringing to you today. So moving from decolonization and its related terms, I'll define the terms more relevant to editing and writing with the decolonization process at the forefront. The first term is conscious language. Language rooted in critical thinking and compassion. The PDF that is going to get distributed does not have the activated links to Karen Yin's Conscious Style Guide and Crystal Shelley's Conscious Language Toolkit. JL will be putting it in the chat so that all of you can have access to those links. Highly, highly recommended if you are even remotely interested in conscious language and how to edit and write with conscious language principles at the forefront. Sensitivity, authenticity, readers, and reading. It is manuscript evaluation or beta reading to ensure that the language style and then, plot, characters, and so on are all written with equity, diversity, and inclusion matters at the forefront. The questions that are asked are what can and should be said about certain identities, or they will consider the impact of specific tropes, attitudes, and words on the intended audience. It is relatively new as a service, but it is offered by editors and publishers to ensure, again, that the language and the style and the tone are all keeping conscious language principles at the forefront. The term sensitivity reading in readers is currently evolving to authenticity reading. Some people will use that in part because sensitivity reading is new, but it has faced almost instant backlash with charges of political correctness, people being too sensitive, I can say whatever I want to say, freedom of expression, all of those things. I have seen a discussion on Twitter where editors specifically are saying that the aim of these types of critiques is, is to simply silence historical viewpoints or to rewrite history. The answer to a lot of these critiques is to say that sensitivity reading, authenticity reading, or bringing or keeping conscious language at the forefront is just to ensure respectful, authentic representation of historically silenced identities. Not too many people are using sensitivity or authenticity reading, but these services are being offered, and I think I can go so far as to say they should be used. So conscious language and ethical editing is usually reading to unearth unconscious bias, which is, by definition, an unconscious implicit assumption, belief, attitude, or stereotype that we may have about different groups. These biases are usually learned mental shortcuts. We all have them, and they often surface within a fraction of a second without us realizing that we've used the shortcut. The key is that we can hold biases against our own group, and we can hold biases that actually go against our stated beliefs. Biases are generally shared within social groups, though people also have biases favoring people who share their identities. And biases are persistent, but can be changed with attention and work. I do recommend the University of Victoria's discussion of equity and human rights, where they talk quite a lot about unconscious bias, how to address it. And if you do a little bit of Google searching, you'll see that there are quizzes One by Harvard Business School is actually really good about unearthing unconscious bias. And there are some massive online courses, MOOCs, on unconscious bias specifically that you could sign up for. So here's the big one: radical or subversive editing. For my definition of radical editing, I draw from Carol Fisher-Saller, who talks about subversive editing. She talks about this in terms of centering the author-editor relationship in service of the audience and not the publisher. For me, conscious editing is often about understanding the need to bend the rules, avoid prescribing or ascribing to a certain set of rigid guidelines or principles, and focusing on what the author is trying to convey. So the questions are, is the message clear? Will it be received as intended? So it has very little to do with changing author voice or changing words or changing, the message. It is more about, is the message clear and will the audience understand it the way it is intended? So if you don't intend to piss certain people off, make sure that you're saying it the way it's supposed to be said. People have used words like inclusion and diverse perspectives to describe the practice of ethical editing. I usually avoid these terms because a word like inclusion invokes the idea of exclusion. Marginal voices assumes there's a center they're speaking to, and so on. Instead, I assume that each voice is valuable. Every story deserves to be told, but each telling must be respectful and authentic. I also recognize my own limitations. While everyone has the right to say whatever they wish to say in the name of historical accuracy, I do not have to listen to it, nor do I have to edit it. So here we go with tips. Canada is a settler colonial state. It is a member of the Commonwealth, a voluntary organization of 56 countries, signatories of the Commonwealth Charter, and King Charles is the head of the Commonwealth. I have my own opinions about that. Commonwealth countries are historically and politically linked to the British Crown. In fact, most of the land in Canada is owned by the Crown. Colonization is not in the past. Genocide, resource extraction, residential schools, racist immigration policies, undermining of Indigenous sovereignty, performing truth and reconciliation, they're all ongoing challenges. The problem, as I see it, when it comes to decolonization and publishing, is that the colonial program is built into the publishing industry. Church, school, book, plus media are parts of a colonial nation-building project that flattens cultural and social difference, advancing ideals of class and social mobility, in turn rooted in white supremacy. The publishing industry maintains control over knowledge dissemination. The bestseller list, for example, determines whose stories are told, when, and how. I would argue that exclusion is part of the mix. It's a constitutional part of how cultural markets work. It doesn't have to be exclusion by design or intent, but exclusion is a result of choosing what to include and what to take a risk on. The assumption is that in writing, editing, and publishing, certain voices have been silenced. So a possible solution is to keep matters of equity, diversity at the forefront each time a writer, editor, or publisher handles a manuscript, to ensure that the content appeals to and includes as many different identities as possible. And I think if we focus on maintaining credibility with a wide readership, the argument for eliminating bias from our writing is depoliticized. So switch the lens from me, my work, to my reader and my message. And I was asked to include examples of what decolonization in editing or radical editing would look like. And I went with examples from news media. So I think that before I actually start putting these examples up, I'm going to do a little bit of a trigger warning because these are from 2023, 2024. And they are talking about genocide. They are talking about racist attitudes. So just be forewarned. All the examples on the two slides are from the essays included in Breach Media's book, When Genocide Wasn't News. A full citation is included in the resources document that will be distributed after this presentation. And I'm a little nervous about doing this right now, so bear with me. My heart rate has just gone up. I'm worried about their reaction. Please do note that these refer to violence, death, destruction, and the deliberate silencing of dissenting voices. This may bring up difficult emotions. Please be aware of your own reactions because there is no way to sanitize these examples and there is no way for me to manage my own emotions in public on recording. Here we go. Globe and Mail in October 16, 2023 said more than 1,400 people were killed by Hamas in southern Israel and more than 2,778 have been killed in Gaza in the past 10 days. So in this example, I've added emphasis wherever I think it's important. So here we're looking at passive voice and naming, which means were killed by Hamas is active voice because by Hamas has been added and we've named who was doing the killing, but we've taken away who has been doing the killing in Gaza by simply saying have been killed. My hands are trembling, sorry. The Globe and Mail in October 26 said horrific massacre of civilians conducted by Hamas in Israel on October 7 and the deadly response of the Israeli military in Gaza. So horrific massacre of civilians. Massacre and slaughter is used only for Israeli deaths. And now this slide has, oh, sorry. Why did that occur in this? So these three paragraphs are from an email written by Nancy Waugh, CBC's Senior Manager of Journalistic Standards, in response to Jeff Finch, retired professor at Humber College, who asked about why CBC was covering the genocide in a biased way. And here you will notice how different words are being used to try to separate how Hamas is somehow much worse than the Israeli militia. The logic and the tone is used to deliberately and carefully dehumanize the Palestinians in Gaza. In fact, she goes so far as to say that just because bombs are dropped from thousands of feet and artillery shells are lofted into Gaza from kilometers away, even though they result in death and destruction on a massive scale, it is carried out remotely. And because the deadly results are unseen, it's not that bad. It's a different kind of event and is described differently as intensive, unrelenting, and punishing. But the Hamas attacks were murderous, vicious, and brutal. News coverage, May 11, 2022. Now, this is before the October 7 launch of the genocide. Shireen Abu Akleh, a veteran journalist working for Al Jazeera, was killed on Wednesday. She was reporting on an Israeli raid into the occupied West Bank when she was shot in the head. And we all know that she was wearing a press vest. She was wearing the prescribed helmet. We are using, however, the passive voice to say she was just killed. We don't know who killed her. in major Western outlets like CNN, CBC, National Post, Toronto Star, and the Toronto Sun published the now debunked lie that Hamas beheaded Israeli babies in October 2023, but they did not present evidence for the lie, nor did they examine the claim per journalistic standards. It was without evidence from Israeli officials and was not challenged when it came up in reporting. Later, in the same month, when the Gaza Health Ministry reported that over 7,000 Palestinians had been killed, many of the same outlets instilled doubt in readers about the death toll by including that the ministry is Hamas run. What they say, as in what Israel says, or what white people say, or I should say Euro-Western people say, is the truth, but what non-whites say is not. The false narratives for war, conflict, right? Like the genocide is being called a war. Resistance is renamed terrorism. Hamas run, of course it's untrue because Hamas runs the ministry. There's deliberate what I'm saying is there's deliberate misrepresentation. Canadian media coverage of the Mount Sinai incident. Now, this is a big one, and this is very relevant to those in Toronto. An emergency rally was organized by the Palestinian Youth Movement in Toronto and Toronto for Palestine on Monday, February 12, 2024, called Hands Off Rafah. It passed by Mount Sinai Hospital for about 15 minutes. During the entire rally, an individual dressed in a black Spider-Man suit climbed in multiple structures, at least 8, according to observers, including the hospital building. There, this individual waved the Palestinian flag. This one instance out of the 8 was used by Olivia Chow, Doug Ford, and Justin Trudeau, among others, as an example of anti-Semitism, calling peaceful protesters terrorist supporters. And this is straight from Toronto Sun, initiating a strong police response leading to arrest of publishers. The difficulty here is that the context is removed from the portrayal. The organized released a statement on February 14, 2024, co-signed by Jews Say No to Genocide, explaining the event and demanding a retraction of the political statements. And yet, politicians are yet to apologize for jumping on the bandwagon and demonizing peaceful protesters. I recognize that the examples I've included here are not sugar-coated, nor are they subtle. And I've done so deliberately because colonial attitudes are pervasive and normalized to such an extent that we don't see them anymore. Mainstream media, journalism, most content positions itself as the voice of the majority and somehow more reasonable, enlightened. And that is problematic. So tropes and attitudes to watch out for, things like terra nullius. Terra nullius literally means nobody's land and has been used to justify multiple genocides because what it says is that nobody lived in that area, so we have a right to it. Renaming is it includes adding European names to new locations. For example, London, Ontario, Paris, Delhi, all of these are locations, actual locations on an Ontario map. Richmond, Surrey, these are all British names that have been applied to Canadian cities. But it also privileges accents and pronunciations. My name is Amber. I'm always called Amber. Oh, how do you say your name? I thought it was just your accent. That's renaming. White savior mentality, the sense held by many in the global north that they have the solutions to the global south's problem and can just show up in a community and begin crafting solutions for the locals without their input. In writing and publishing, it often shows up in an almost anthropological interest in other identities. For example, use of identity politics to learn about other cultures, or to add token characters or locations to gesture to diversity. Then there's deficit discourse, framing Indigenous identity or a global majority identity as somehow lacking or presenting in a frame of deficiency, failure, generally negative. Think about it as oppression Olympics almost. 12 years a slave, anyone? Deeply felt loyalty to and adherence to Eurocentric ways of being, valuing, and doing. It can manifest in demands of authoritative sources or an outsider view, or, privileging histories of European settlement over non-European societies, privileging the European point of view. Think back to the map that I displayed. It only showed you European colonization. Rigid adherence to an insistence on Western modes of narrative and organization, appropriating non-Western modes of storytelling without acknowledging the source, a non-linear method, oral storytelling, without saying this is how I learned it, taking stories of jinn. For example, the genie stories, they're all appropriations. Sorry, I moved too fast. An expectation that English will be the language of writing used in a particular style, and little flexibility afforded to multilingual writers, right? So editing out non-English words, insisting on adding italics to non-English words, insisting on translations of particular phrases, explanations for dishes, things like that. And then limiting the topics and opinions considered safe for a global majority writer to address. Who gets to say what? I'll leave it at that because it looks like I might be running out of time. So what can we do as writers? We may not know what to look for when we are trying to eliminate bias from our content. By definition, unconscious bias is unconscious. So we need to first approach difference and otherness with kindness, respect, and a willingness to learn. We may need to hire professionals and experts. Examine power dynamics, address unconscious bias, do your research, come from a place of understanding and empathy, listen but do not appropriate, hire sensitivity and authenticity readers, and have discussions, receive feedback, and then address that feedback by taking real, impactful action. A little bit more specific advice: read, cite, center Indigenous and global majority voices, and be critical and aware of the voices you choose to privilege. And the reason I added aware here is because critical can sometimes go in the negative. Like, I'm thinking about it more in terms of critique. Review terms and types of language you use when writing about Indigenous peoples and global majority peoples specifically, and matters related to those specific identities. Seek free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples and historically marginalized voices before writing up or publishing any information they shared with you. And it is not enough to say, I have a best friend. Write ethically. So in fiction, for example, consider why you feel the need to include a character's faith practice. Does a detail like the character's skin color impact the plot setting or narrative arc? Carefully consider where you seek to publish. Does the publisher have a decolonizing policy? Do they support First Nations and or global majority researchers or alternative publication practices? Or are they just jumping on the bandwagon? And examine power imbalances. Recognize that you are likely to have blind spots. Unacknowledged, implicit biases are dangerous. It is okay not to know everything. Just be respectful and pay attention. Once you learn of something you may have been doing wrong, use the opportunity to grow. Remind yourself that Canada's settler colonial landscape centers whiteness and flattens non-white ways of living and being. The publishing industry upholds and perpetuates colonial nation building that privileges white supremacy, that makes us complicit in those structures. To write and edit sensitively and responsibly, we need to first acknowledge and examine our own white colonial lens. Because of how unconscious bias works, we need to deliberately and consciously use methodologies and strategies to help ensure a radical lens when writing and editing. Questions of audience and power can be helpful. Whose voice is being privileged, but more importantly, who is being silenced or erased? There is no single right way of writing for inclusion. Multiple elements and factors determine how inclusive a final manuscript will be. A writer-editor relationship can and should endeavor to create content that is inclusive and respectful. It is our job to keep ourselves informed and updated, but to also avoid prescriptivism. And I'll end on this note. We all make mistakes. You saw me making quite a few in this particular presentation. It is important to learn from them and try not to repeat them. So as I said at the beginning, I could not fit all of the resources I wanted to give you on one slide. So I've just added a screenshot here. This particular document will be distributed at when the video link is distributed. And we are moving on to Q&A. And just to say, if you all have to leave and you don't get to stay in the, for the rest of the Q&A, feel free to reach out to me through my website, my LinkedIn, or my website linked in this particular presentation, or just Google my name and reach out to me and we will continue this discussion. I will answer every question that comes up. Over to you, JL.
So we'll leave that up. That's great. Perfect. I am going to focus on questions in the question and answer that are about practice. So how do you handle, how should writers do this? What should editors do about that? I'm not going to dive into questions that are about perhaps specific political views or like, how do you feel about this? Just because I think the nature of this presentation is about practice and craft. I think you've provided a really great foundation for this work, and I want to respect those who are here who are asking about the work of it. So, first question I wanted to talk about, because you talked about sensitivity readers, is how might new readers include and or propose requests for funding for sensitivity or authenticity consulting? Do you have thoughts on like how people should manage the financial aspect of bringing in
That's a difficult one. I know that a lot of the sensitivity readers right now are working directly with publishers. So the sensitivity reading is being folded into the traditional publishing process. So a publisher will reach out to, a roster of sensitivity readers, depending on the project, depending on the topic. And then the cost of it is just in there. Oh, this is problematic. I need somebody to take a look at it. Here, I'll just send it off. And that's how the sensitivity readers are going to get paid. If you yourself are concerned and you're an independent writer and you're concerned about the cost of it, the way I see it is, if you front load the cost of it at the beginning, when you are wedded and when you are working with a sensitivity reader, you paying them what it's worth, you're actually saving yourself money in the long run when your sales plummet, right? Or when you get that, I can't believe she said that, and why didn't nobody catch it? Because even the big publishers have been taken, they've been ripped apart for not taking authenticity into account before publishing. There have been some major public scandals for traditional publishing. So yes, the cost could seem pretty high at the up front, especially, when you're starting out and you feel like you might not have enough funds to get it professionally edited, professionally read. There is an editing process in place that allows your work to go through all of the different stages. So I would say after your draft stage, after your self-editing stage, before pushing it out for traditional or self-publishing, um, join a writers group and then see if other writers are also seeing this
Mm.
need for a sensitivity authenticity reader. So when you get that kind of feedback, you automatically see that if a group of writers or your friends or somebody is talking to you about, I have a icky feeling about how this particular passage is working, find a way to pay a sensitivity reader, because the cost at the end of it, they are terrible. Think yellow face, and I'll
Yeah.
leave it at that.
Well, and I think that I'll just say two things about that. One, whenever you get an advance, however small or however large, try and think about that as money that you put back into your book to make it go
Very
where it
good.
needs to go. So that's like a financial advice I'll share there. I'll also say make sure you get the sensitivity read at the right moment in the process
Mhm.
so that you have time to change. It shouldn't just be a read this over and give me the check mark that everything is okay. And
Very
this is
good
what I heard from a sensitivity reader back in the day. You want to give it to them when you are still open to really
to really.
addressing
Which
the
is why I thought about it in terms of the draft stage,
yeah,
right? Like before you even go into the marketing of it, before you go into hiring a literary agent, that's when, like, when you're still working in massaging, that's
yeah,
when you want the
yeah,
sensitivity read.
yeah. It's great. So this question is about how do you navigate the contradiction between the academic English often required for dissertations and plain language, or I think you use the term conscious language.
So plain language and conscious language are both hand in hand.
Mhm.
And academic language and plain language are not opposite. So plain language simply says, make your work, write it in such a way that a reader understands it and can act upon it within the first read. So the first time they read it, the first time they see it, they should be able to understand it and take the required action, right? That's all plain language simply says. So academic language is littered with run-on sentences, passive sentences, and lack of pronouns, lots and lots of jargon. So jargon is field-specific terminology. So plain language will simply go in and say, okay, if you've got field-specific terminology, define it, spell it out. So if you're using tons of abbreviations, make sure you spell out the abbreviation, and you've got a list of abbreviations either at the beginning or at the back, depending on what your format is. Don't use passive sentences too often unless it is strategic for you to say, like you want to, you know, were killed versus they killed kind of thing. And just think about it that way. Academic language and plain language are not in opposition. They simply say that a reader should be able to understand your message easily. So focus on the audience. If your audience is all experts, you can use the jargon, you can use the passive language, you can use the big words and because everybody will be just nodding along because they understand all of the references. But if your audience is publication in a blog,
Mm.
then just cut your sentences short, vary the sentence length, explain your jargon, and go from there.
Yeah, it's funny. I see that a lot in my work with bylaws, in which the language is legal and it's meant to
Mm-hmm.
protect like the bigger institution and
Mm-hmm.
be unclear to the user so that they don't sue or they don't know that they're being,
Mm-hmm.
and simplifying from a charitable organization, the language, the legal language is so that you're recognizing the people who need to understand it aren't the owners of the institution. It's the people utilizing the services of the institution as well. So I really
Reader focus always.
I love it. Okay, so there's really good questions. We're going to work through as many as possible. I know we're coming across the 1 o'clock hour. I conferred with Umber beforehand, and I will continue. We're going to go a little bit over in terms of what we do. I'll have some announcements at the end, but I think it's really important to give as much time as possible. And so you can come back to the recording if you are in a very
Yes.
time sensitive moment. But here we go. Keep going. How can an editor enact decolonization in a call for papers and as they send out invitations to contributors?
That's a very complex question, actually,
Maybe figure
because
out like one or two key tips because there's probably like 10
call for
things you could
papers and a
recommend.
decolonizing lens. Uh, your topic, number one, is going to
Mhm.
determine what kinds of papers you are going to get. Where you publish your call for papers is also going to determine what kinds of papers you're going to get. So, if your call for papers is very clearly, we are looking specifically for a decolonial lens on this particular topic, you're going to get that, right?
Mhm.
So spell it out that this is what I'm looking for. Like I work with two independent presses, Fernwood and Trace, and both of them make it very clear right off the bat that they function on the radical, the conscious language, the oppositional sort of, we are not traditional publishers kind of uh, policy, right? So even in your call for papers, the topic that you choose, where you publish, which universities you target, which scholars you wish to include, which publisher you choose to work with, because often the publisher will determine where your call for papers is going to be published. So if you've got a publisher lined up already, which publisher have you chosen to work with for your specific collection of essays will also determine what kinds of papers you're going to get.
Mhm.
Um, if you are asking me whether, how do I make my call for papers more decolonial? Like that's another
Mhm.
implied question in here. I would say do a little bit more research
Mhm.
on the topic that you want to publish on before, or collect papers about before you even put that call for papers together, right? Look up different journals, look up all of the different publication avenues. Think about the format that you would want. Do you want it as a special journal issue? Do you want it as a book collection? Do you want a wide readership? Do you want a specific type of readership? Are these papers that are going to be presented at conferences? Are you going to use this collection of essays to launch a collective? There's different reasons why a particular call for papers is published. So think through all of that, do your research, do the legwork before sitting down and writing. And if there's a specific audience that you're thinking about, seek out scholars in that particular audience to see if they are willing to collaborate with you.
Love that. One of our favorite questions at Fold is who's missing. I think it's also whenever you
Yes.
pick a topic, be aware of who's typically not included in that topic because that's what makes it interesting to read too. Okay, so this goes back to something we were talking about before, which is the sensitivity readers. And it was like the question is I want to include the cost of a sensitivity reader in a CCA grant. Do you have like a range or a recommended like no less than this and basically no less than this is usually the thing people are worried about. I think they don't want to offend someone and they want to make sure they've put enough in it that they can get someone of quality. So that's
Because sensitivity reading is so different based on the topic, based on the manuscript, and based on the editor or, beta reader doing it, even the length of the manuscript could determine the type of topic, how many people are working in that particular topic. I mean, for example, LGBTQ versus a Muslim editor. I don't have a range. I'm sorry to disappoint you there. What I would say is before putting it in the grant, put out a call going, hey, I'm doing a little bit of research. This is my specific topic. This is the length of my manuscript. And this is the kind of feedback I'm looking for. what is the range I should expect to pay specifically for this thing so that I can put it in my grant, right? That would be an easier way of getting the answer to your question than asking somebody like me. Like if I had a 100-page manuscript, which was writing about divorce in Islam, because it is such a scholarship heavy topic and I bring so much of my background, like 15 years of working on this particular topic, my charge would be an hourly charge. And it would include the research that is necessary for your manuscript. So it would be a pretty hefty fee. But if it is, 50 pages on, have I used the word Black correctly to represent identity, then I'm not bringing as much of my heavy set emotional. So my charge will not be that heavy. So, it really does depend on the manuscript. I wish I could answer, like I've always wanted a how much will it cost answer.
Break it down.
So
I think you bring up a good point, Amber, and I think it's about, especially when you're doing a grant, I think it's most helpful to have a very specific quote in mind. So
very much
you
so.
may want to go into the practice of actually trying to hire, not hire, but
Yes.
identify someone you would hire, get a quote,
Yes.
and include that actual person in the
Very
application
much so.
rather than just sort of generally guessing at what you might need on the other side and
Yeah.
hoping it sticks.
Because grant applications, and we've got Editors Canada has a grant writing, grant proposal editor who's her niche is grant proposals, Letitia Handel. And I would recommend working with somebody who has submitted and won multiple grants rather than going it alone. Get advice, do the research, because your chances of getting the grant are going to increase multifold if you do that research. I can't give you that answer off the top of my head.
There's so many good questions. I'm like, we're just going to power through.
For
Okay,
sure.
how do you navigate giving feed? This is a slightly different spin on what we've been talking about, but something that I know a lot of people face. How do you navigate giving feedback to someone who isn't aware that there is unconscious bias in their writing and they respond with fragility? Specifically, how do you balance self-care with the emotional labor of helping a writer receive the feedback and learn from it?
Okay, that is a difficult one. And you kind of saw me managing my emotions when I was doing my example slides. Um, I actually attended a Red Pencil session on exactly this topic by Brittany Yost. She recorded a session on working with sensitive topics. So, number one, recognize that you've been triggered, right? If you saw the unconscious bias, you got triggered, that means that the reader is going to get triggered. So, you're the stand in for the reader. Point number one. So recognize that this is important and that it is important to absorb it and it is important to navigate it sensitively with empathy and with understanding. So the right off the bat, when you are composing the query about something before you even send it to the author, step away from your query, let it rest. So my instinct is to type. This is terrible. This sucks. Don't publish it. But I do it in a notepad. Okay. Then I step away, come back to it a day later, read what I've written on notepad, adjust it, edit it, approach it with here. A reader might not understand this the way it is intended, or it could possibly be misread as XYZ. Have you considered changing it to ABC? And then give them a list of options. If they come back to you with, you know what? No, you don't know what you're talking about. How do you even edit it properly? Do you even know? I've just had a major press tell me that they're going to cut my fees short because they didn't like how I edited. That's okay. It's their work. It is their idea. The audience reaction is going to go to them, not to you. My instinct at that point is to say, that's okay. please continue, and we will stat your writing the way it is, but can you please take my name off the acknowledgements? And that is enough of a message to say this was important enough. And if they still continue, then at least it's not coming back to you and your reputation, because it is the writer's work. They are the ones who are going to own it. They are the ones who have to publish it. Brittany actually recalled an incident of a major piece of literature that was published, but the background scene of that is that it went through multiple sensitivity reads, multiple iterations, and the author kept pushing back, going, nope, we are going to publish as it is. It got published, and Kirkus Review actually bombed it. So it never got sold. But the editors took their names off. So just recognize that you've done your best. You've given the answer, that you've done the query properly. You approached it with empathy and understanding. You've told them the solutions. They're the ones who've decided to not take it. Take your name off if you feel comfortable. Get paid and move on.
Like it. Okay, so just a few more questions I think that we have
Mhm.
time for. This question, some of these questions I'm like, do I not understand it? Maybe you'll understand it better.
Okay,
The
go
question
ahead.
is, how do we balance decolonizing the concept of authorship while still centering marginalized voices? And the person
Oh,
clarified, I try to explore co-creation with shared process and credit, but as groups grow, it becomes less clear.
so I think that this is coming from the perspective of non-European ways of owning knowledge.
Mm,
That's how I'm reading the question.
sure.
So I think I've understood that correctly. There are particular cultures where knowledge is owned collectively, and you don't have to cite a specific author. Just because knowledge is out there, it's out there, and you get to use it. I was actually working with a translator who translated from Urdu into English recently, and the development editor actually went, I need citation for this particular translation. And she pushed back on, it's in the publication. It's in the public domain. Why do I need to cite this? And it's like, no, no, no. This is, so I think that's where the question is coming from, that knowledge is owned collectively, and that no one single author ever owns knowledge. And that is how they're reading it, as a decolonial lens. And I can see that. I'm also thinking of Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House. But we have our limitations are the system that we are working in. That's what Lord also talks about, that we have to continue working with the tools that we are given. It is a difficult balance to strike, and that is something that I can acknowledge. Your own perspective of how knowledge is owned and disseminated in direct tension with the colonial publishing industry, the way I've highlighted it in this particular webinar. So I would say, again, reset and focus on what that particular project's purpose is and what that particular project's message is. Is there a policy on making sure that this is 100% decolonialized, non-Western project?
Mm.
If it is, then think about it from that particular perspective. Have other people collaborating with you on the particular project. I'm thinking of the anarcho-indigenism book that I've actually included in my list of recommended sources. It's a collection of interviews with major Indigenous scholars talking about one topic in multiple ways. So that decenters the way a particular topic is presented, because everybody has a different take, different perspectives. So they brought in an Indigenous scholar from Hawaii, and they brought in an Indigenous scholar from Canada and from Australia, and and they're all trying to grapple. That's the word I'm looking for. Grapple with this idea of anarcho-indigenism. right?
Mm.
So that decenters a white way of being because there's always that one scholar who defines anarcho-indigenism and then everybody else kind of circles around it,
Mm.
right? Like my instinct was to talk about Audre Lorde really quickly, right? So that is another way. So what I'm trying to say in my answer is to focus on the project, focus on the project's needs, focus on the audience, the intended audience, and then think about how you can handle all of these different competing, because colonial and decolonial are very much opposites, competing uh, interests.
Mm.
Is that, yeah? Um, it will all have to be collaboration, I think is the word I'm looking for here. Collaborate with the developmental editor, with the writer, with the scholars, um, get a focus group going and see how you can handle this difficult minefield.
Love it. I have one more question about a nonfiction side, and then I'm going to, there's a few questions that come in that are on the more fictional side, so I wanted to
Mm.
mix that in there. So the first question about nonfiction is about your definition of colonization that you shared and how
Mhm.
you defined a nation and distinguish it from another nation.
Ah. Um, I'm going to go back to Anderson and Gramsci when it comes to thinking about nation and borders. I'm a post-colonial scholar by training, so that's my instinct, my foundation. These are all modern concepts, the idea of nation, the order, the idea of borders, the idea of identity. These are all very much 20th and 21st century ideas. How do I personally define nation? I go back to the Urdu Arabic concept of ummah.
Mm.
Uh, and ummah for me is shared values, beliefs, systems, religions, economies. That's the basic foundation of how I think about nation. So a Muslim ummah is Muslim and together and a nation based on shared religious beliefs and social beliefs and cultural beliefs, right? That's how an ummah is formed. Um, the Western concept of a nation is shared within borders, but also through attitudes and beliefs. Um, Other nations would be moving together as a cohesive group with shared practices, dress, food, uh, parenting. So depending on where you are and depending on who you are, your definition of nation is not going to match with my definition of nation, and that's okay. You can take the academic approach, which I took, Anderson and Gramsci. You can take the cultural approach that I took. I could also think about it in terms of watan, attached to land. So the idea of um, a country, but more because I can belong to the Pakistani Watan even if I'm not actually living on the land,
Mm.
right? So, and it immediately brings forth feelings of attachment to land and patriotism and no critique of anything. And that's, again, a slippery slope. So, um, I think I'll leave it at that.
Mm.
Nation can have multiple definitions depending on who you talk to.
Love that. There's so much, this topic, I like what you shared about decolonization and that it being a process and this thing that it's learning, it's evolving, it's dependent on people. I think it's always the thing that makes it more complex, right? People want definitive answers. I would like to solve problem X by equals
Yeah.
problem Y. But it's one of those things that's like evolving, it's moving, it's changing, and it's the
Yes,
responsiveness that really, for me, makes it exciting because it feels like the more you think about it, the more you can do. Okay,
basically.
fiction question.
Yes.
In fiction, how do you think about balancing the goal to avoid using marginalized or silenced groups or cultures in a cast of characters versus a desire to draw a picture for readers that is clear that the story's setting, society, culture includes lots of different people and cultures?
Oh, my favorite fiction books are those where a multicultural identity is suddenly revealed because she has an auntie, or or she eats biryani, or so it I think that in fiction specifically, this idea of representation becomes very poignant.
Mm,
Um, you can do it through naming,
mm.
you can do it through food, you can do it through talking about Brampton in
Mm.
your book, right? Or
Yay,
bringing
Brent!
in, right? I'm from Ontario. I lived 20 years there, so in London, Ontario. So you talk about Brampton, or you talk about Gerrard Street, or you talk about Surrey, or Richmond, or Scarborough, or
Yeah.
whatever. Make it a part of the fabric of the story rather than going, I've got a brown friend and her skin was glowing in the sun,
Mm,
that's just so in your face, and it doesn't do justice to how real people function with each other, especially a friend group,
mm,
right? You don't have typecasts in your friend group, and the instinct to typecast is what conscious language and sensitivity language or authenticity readings are trying to get you to move away from, right? Like, don't do tokenism just for the sake of tokenism. You want to represent your understanding of multiculturalism, then bring that to the forefront. In like, and if your circle does not have the brown friend, like, I mean, think Friends from the 90s, right? No brown folk, no black folk. Yeah, New York didn't have brown folk. And now we've got Zoran Mamdani. So yeah, I had to bring him in.
I love it. I
But
love it.
you know what I'm saying though, right? Like um representation for the sake of representation is not enough.
Mm,
In the fictional landscape that you're building, um, it has to be authentic to what you are building,
mm,
not to what you think should be, right? And if it's authentic to what you are building, and if your experience does not have a diverse cast of characters, then it doesn't have a diverse cast of characters, and that's okay. That's your understanding of it. So go with that. You don't have to have a hijabi Muslim in every book. We
yeah.
don't need to be there.
And it's funny, I'm going to tie this last question in with it because for me, the question is, can you talk a bit more about the idea of writing for as wide a readership as possible? That seems like it would also pose a risk for tokenization, which is what you're talking about and what often happens. And I think,
Basically.
and I'll just throw in my thought and then you can tell
Please
me, Amber, if
do.
I,
I
so
love that.
I think the more specific you are, the more authentic the work becomes. And in being specific, you often can't cover everything and shouldn't cover everything and won't have everyone. But I think it's understanding where your worldview comes from and living really precisely in
Yes.
that. So, like, if you go to put a maid in a novel or a nurse, and your instinct is, I'm going to make them Filipino, understand why that's happening and either address it, put that in there and address the sort of like racism that's intrinsic in that, or don't do it as a way to counter that sort of assumption and that culture. If you're not going to address it, don't drop a
Don't do it.
stereotype in there and tokenize in that way.
Exactly.
And so I
Exactly.
try and get as specific as possible even in thinking about my reader. I try and think about a specific person and not a like this is for everybody. I think I'm writing
Yeah.
for this one woman, this one man, this one kid. And that helps me determine the language I choose, the things I address, the things I explain, the things I don't explain. And I think that helps avoid some of what that question is about the tokenization, the cover everybody, diversity as a rainbow, blah, blah, blah.
And you know what? I'm actually going to, I thought that I might not, but you know what? I'm, what was it? The American, the novel with the La Bestia that had like a gigantic, suddenly the name An American
Mm.
Story. You know what I'm
Oh,
talking about?
I think I do, but I
It,
have
it
heard.
had La Bestia, like basically a woman and her child escaping the drug cartels by riding the top of a particular train and the big scandal about it. American Dirt, thank you. La
That's what I
Bestia, the
was.
one
I was
about the
like, I think
train.
that's it,
Thank
but
you, thank you, thank you so much.
yeah.
Seeley, I want to say, thank you. The American Dirt had this big scandal around it based on the identity of the author,
Mm,
right? And the scandal was not that the white woman can't talk about that particular topic. The scandal was that the white woman lied about her identity and that she said that she can talk about it because she has that. So that is actually classic case of misunderstanding
mm,
this idea of representation and the ability to write. That white woman could have written the same novel without marketing herself
mm,
as part of that particular culture. And because it's a fantastic novel,
mm,
it is well written, it is well researched, right? And it brings a very, very important story to the forefront. A woman escaping with a child
mm,
from drug cartels. And it is an important topic to talk about. It talks about border, it talks about immigration, talks about feminism, talks about violence. But I think that there's this instinct to say, I get to write about this because actually did a major disservice to that particular novel. So, yes, representation matters. Yes, diverse voices writing diverse stories matters. But if your instinct is to say only a brown Muslim woman can write that Muslim love story, I'm sorry that you're doing the exact opposite of what conscious language and radical writing and editing actually want you to do. What we really want you to do is do the research, acknowledge your own background, say that I did my research, that if I've made a mistake, I'm sorry, tell me what my mistake was and I'll learn from it, rather than going, oh my God, they hate me because I'm a white woman. Sorry.
mm. Well, there
Okay.
was a book. There was a book in Canada in a similar situation where, when I read it, it was a great book. The author identified as Indigenous, and I was like, "This is informative. I've never seen this perspective on this topic before." Turns out they weren't Indigenous, and I don't think it made the book any better or worse, but I think the learning I was taking was very different, right? I'm seeing
Mm-hmm.
another
Mm-hmm.
colonized version of Indigenous folks rather than an
Mm-hmm.
actual Indigenous person reflecting truth about their community. And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Which takes
Apologies,
me
it's a
back to what
touchy
I was
issue.
saying.
Thanks for saying that in the chat. It is true. It's not clean, it's not easy, but it's really important to think about and talk about.
Yeah.
I am going to close things up, first of all, by saying thank you, Ember, for being here. Thank you for your thoughts, your wisdom, your concern, your nerves. I think you talked about being nervous, but I don't think it was perceived as nervous from us. I think it was knowledge, and I think the nerves are about when you're talking about something important, you want to make sure you do it well and do it justice. And I just think you did such a great job. I'm going to close with a few just housekeeping announcements from our side of things. Thank you so much for being here at Fold Academy. I've put in the chat the survey. We'd love to know your thoughts, feedback, suggestions for future workshops. Our next Fold Academy will be coming in 2026 in the new year. We'll be making an announcement about that soon. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. You go to thefoldcanada.org. Um, if you haven't already done so, you can support the Fold by checking out our Fold apparel as well and grabbing some cool gear. And lastly, we appreciate any and all donations. So you can go to thefoldcanada.org/donate to make a donation to the festival and to the work we do at Fold Academy. We certainly appreciate it, and we appreciate you all for being here on a Saturday afternoon or for watching this back on demand. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. A reminder, the recording will be sent out the week after the event. It will include the PDF. We will get it out as soon as possible, but we correct the captions and make sure those are all lined up. So that's one of the reasons it comes out a little bit later than instantaneously. Thank you so much for being here, for being so thoughtful. Thank you for the support in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year at Fold Academy. Bye, Elmer. Thanks so much for being here.
I just wanted to make sure that I get a copy of the Q&A and the chat.
Sure. Yeah, I can get that too.
Yes.
For sure.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.